The day I got the eviction notice taped to my lake cabin door, I thought it was some kind of joke. Bold red letters, stamped with the HOA logo, claiming I was illegally occupying community land. It read like your typical HOA power trip, until I saw the fine print threatening legal action and forced removal. What they didn't know was that the cabin they were trying to evict me from, I didn't just own it. I owned the entire lake lot. The land, the shoreline, every inch they thought they controlled. And by the time they realized it, they'd already stepped way out of line. If you've ever had to deal with an HOA that thinks it runs the world, buckle in. Because this isn't a story about a cabin. It's about what happens when you try to steal land from the wrong person. My name is Eli Mercer, and if you'd asked me 5 years ago what I thought my life would look like, I would have told you spreadsheets, airports, and deadlines. I spent over 2 decades in real estate finance, middle management at a national firm, grinding through 60-hour weeks and chasing end-of-quarter bonuses like my life depended on them. It took the death of someone I loved to realize what I'd been missing. My Uncle Henry passed away suddenly, heart failure in his sleep, out of nowhere. He had no wife, no kids, and no real attachments beyond a few close friends and me. But he left behind something that changed everything. Tucked inside his will, beneath the list of modest possessions and a few instructions for an old Labrador I ended up adopting, was a simple sentence. I leave the Mercer Lake cabin to my nephew Eli. He always appreciated silence. I didn't even know he still owned it. I remembered visiting when I was young, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Uncle Henry was the black sheep of the family, a war vet who wore the same flannel shirts for 20 years and couldn't care less about stock options or polished dining tables. But I remember the cabin, the smell of wood smoke, the squeaky dock that stretched over the lake like a half-finished thought, the strange creaking sounds the old place made when it cooled down at night. What I didn't realize back then was that Uncle Henry hadn't just owned the cabin. He owned the entire lot it sat on. A chunk of land that stretched over 12 acres, wrapped like a horseshoe around the southern bend of Lake Kershaw. And now it was mine. After settling his estate, I drove up to the lake for the first time in nearly 30 years. The cabin looked untouched, weathered maybe, but not run down. The same old tin chimney, the same blackened steps. The wind still carried that sweet mix of pine and water and something older I couldn't name. I stood there for a long while before walking up to the porch. I didn't knock. That summer, I made it my home. I left my job, sold my apartment in the city, and used the proceeds to renovate the cabin carefully. I didn't want to ruin what Henry had built. I just wanted to live in it. I updated the wiring, reinforced the deck, and added a small solar setup in the back for good measure. But everything else stayed the same. The wood stove, the rocking chair, the little cabinet where Henry used to keep fishing tackle and a bottle of good bourbon, left untouched like he might come walking in any minute, grumbling about how loud the loons were that morning. At first, I thought I'd be lonely. But the thing about silence is it grows on you. Lake Kershaw was mostly surrounded by newer developments, gated communities with gravel drives, vacation rentals, and homes where no one stayed past Labor Day. But my cabin sat on the far end, separated by a thick grove of trees and a private road that hadn't seen a snowplow in years. It was peaceful, secluded. Mine. The first letter from the HOA arrived in a clean white envelope, addressed to E. Mercer, parcel owner. It was welcoming, actually. A brief introduction to the Crescent Shore HOA, some local bylaws, a pamphlet on trash collection, and aesthetic guidelines. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I assumed they were sending it to all lakefront property owners, even though my lot wasn't inside their boundary lines. I gave it a quick read, chuckled at some of the absurdly detailed clauses about paint shades and fire pit size, and tossed it in the drawer. Good luck enforcing that out here, I muttered. Looking back, maybe I should have paid more attention. Over the next few months, I settled into something I never really had before, a rhythm. I woke with the sun, fished most mornings, cooked on the wood stove when I felt like it, read books I'd never had time for. No phone signal unless I stood on a rock behind the cabin. No neighbors, no traffic, just trees, wind, and water. Occasionally, I'd hear boats from the other side of the lake, weekenders or teenagers tearing through the channel with loud music. But they never came near my shore. I liked it that way. Then, late one September afternoon, a black SUV with tinted windows rumbled up the road and stopped just before my property line. It didn't pull in. It just idled for a moment. A woman stepped out, maybe in her 50s, wearing a cardigan that screamed committee chair and holding a clipboard that confirmed it. She waved politely. I returned the gesture from the porch. "Mr. Mercer," she called. "That's me. I'm Karen Lovell. I'm with the Crescent Shore Homeowners Association. Just wanted to formally introduce myself. We've sent a few letters your way." I nodded. "Gotcha. Appreciate the info." She smiled tightly. "We'd like to schedule a visit soon to go over some of the compliance details." I raised an eyebrow. "Compliance?" "Yes. There are some concerns about non-conforming structures on lake-adjacent properties. We just want to make sure everyone's contributing to the overall harmony of the shoreline." I blinked. "You're talking about my cabin?" "Well, technically yes. It's been grandfathered in under previous agreements, but there are still some visibility issues we'd like to discuss." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked over to the edge of my deck and looked out over the water. Then I looked back at her. "This land isn't in your HOA," I said plainly. She blinked. "Well, all lake-facing properties fall under Crescent Shore's visual zoning sphere." "That's not a legal thing," I replied. She stiffened slightly. "We just want to ensure everyone follows the same standards. Property values depend on consistency." "Appreciate your concern," I said, my tone still even. "But unless the county says otherwise, my standards are between me and the trees." Karen didn't say much after that. She nodded, forced another smile, and got back in her SUV. I watched her leave. The dust hadn't even settled before I felt the first ripple of unease. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Like I didn't belong. Over the next few weeks, more letters arrived, each one a little firmer than the last. Warnings about shoreline clutter, dock permits, even smoke emissions from my wood stove. I ignored them. My deed was clear. My lot was unincorporated and had been the family for decades. The HOA had no legal authority here. I knew it, but it became clear that they didn't care. One afternoon, I returned from town to find a laminated notice zip-tied to my gate. Final warning. Non-compliance will result in enforcement action. It was signed by Karen, dated, stamped with their ridiculous HOA emblem. That was the moment it stopped being amusing. This wasn't some petty oversight. This was a message. They were going to try to force me out through pressure, through paperwork, through whatever bureaucratic nonsense they thought they could throw my way. What they didn't know was that the cabin they thought was an eyesore sat on a parcel bigger than their entire subdivision. And I had the paperwork to prove it. The next letter didn't come in an envelope. It came in a manila folder, hand-delivered by someone who didn't bother to knock. I found it tucked under a loose rock on my front steps, way down like it was some backwoods warrant. The HOA logo was stamped in the corner again, this time with bold lettering across the top. Notice of non-compliance and pending enforcement. Inside was a 5-page document, legalese stitched together with enough threatening undertones to make it feel like a lawsuit, even though it wasn't. The letter opened with a summary of alleged violations: unauthorized occupancy, non-permitted structure, visual disturbance to shared lakefront. It went on to accuse me of encroaching on community-regulated shoreline access, and stated that if corrective action was not taken within 14 days, I would be subject to HOA-administered penalties, including possible removal from the premises. I sat down at my kitchen table and read the letter 3 times. They were accusing me of trespassing on my own land, on a cabin that had been in my family for over 40 years. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a power play. Karen and her little HOA regime weren't confused. They weren't misinformed. They were escalating, testing how far they could push before I pushed back. That night, I pulled out the original deed from my file cabinet. It was yellowed at the edges, but perfectly intact, county stamped, recorded, notarized. The lines of the property stretched wide around the lake like a lasso. The lot didn't end at the water line. It enclosed it. It was a rare, clean-cut parcel from back before this area was overdeveloped and carved into uniform boxes. This land, this cabin, and the entire south bend of Lake Kershaw weren't just mine in sentiment. They were mine by law. But Karen didn't know that. Not yet. The next morning, I drove into town to speak with the county clerk. I wanted to confirm what I already knew, but I also wanted a digital paper trail. I requested official parcel maps, historical ownership data, and documentation showing that my land was not and had never been part of the Crescent Shore subdivision. The clerk, a woman named Sherry who'd been in that office since the 90s, clicked through her computer and raised her eyebrows. "Oh, you're the Mercer cabin." "That's right," I said. "You're not part of that HOA mess." "Never were." I nodded. "Mind printing that?" She did, and I left with a folder full of legal clarity. But it didn't matter, because when I returned to the cabin, I found something even worse than another letter. There were footprints on my deck. Mud tracked up to the front door, clean swipes along the railing like someone had leaned there. A cigarette but still smoldered in the dirt near my fire pit. And this time, the zip-tied notice wasn't on my gate. It was nailed to the cabin wall, right beneath the window. Second notice: unauthorized structure on community-controlled land. My stomach turned. This wasn't just a mail campaign anymore. Someone had come onto my property. They walked my deck, watched my house, left their message like a calling card. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line and filed a report. The deputy who showed up was polite, young, and a little nervous. He walked the perimeter, jotted a few notes, but said there wasn't much they could do without a name or a camera. "You're sure this land's yours?" he asked. I handed him the folder from the county clerk. He flipped through it, his eyebrows rising slowly. "Huh, yeah, that's clear. Don't know what their HOA's thinking. They think they can scare me out." "Well," he said, glancing in the cabin, "they're picking the wrong hill to die on." But the pressure didn't let up. Over the next week, I started noticing things. Trash bins mysteriously knocked over when I returned from town. My mailbox left open after deliveries. A boat from the far side of the lake slowing to a crawl near my dock, then speeding away as soon as I stepped outside. The neighbors started keeping their distance. The ones I'd occasionally waved to on grocery runs now looked the other way. Some crossed the street. Others whispered in low tones at the market, glancing over their shoulders like I was contagious. I heard it firsthand one afternoon at the gas station. Two men, maybe in their 40s, stood by the air pump, talking just loud enough to be overheard. "I heard he's squatting on conservation land. Nah, it's HOA controlled. He's trying to claim it's private. Whole place is going to get locked down." Figures. Guy that doesn't even show up to meetings. They didn't see me walk past until I was already at my truck. I caught their looks. The quick glance. The quiet judgment. That's when it clicked. Karen wasn't just targeting me with fines. She was poisoning the well. She was using her position to spread lies, manipulate the narrative, and isolate me socially before pushing the next legal move. It was strategy, not petty revenge. It was war. I started keeping a journal. Every letter, every incident, every face I saw slowing down outside the property. Julia, Uncle Henry's old friend and former attorney, called me after I forwarded her the second eviction threat. She'd handled Henry's estate and had known the history of the land better than anyone alive. "She's bluffing," Julia said. "She has no jurisdiction. But if you don't respond legally, she's going to build a case on your silence." That was her play. Push me to the edge, wait for me to snap or disappear, and then claim I'd abandoned an illegal structure. Except I wasn't going anywhere. I sent a certified letter to the HOA office, addressed to Karen Lowell directly. It included copies of my deed, property map, county records, and a formal cease and desist order for trespassing. I gave her 5 business days to respond. She didn't. Instead, I received another notice. This one labeled Final Action, Voluntary Departure Deadline, stating that if I didn't vacate the disputed cabin within 72 hours, the HOA would begin proceedings to reclaim the land for community development. Attached was a crude mock-up of a park pavilion labeled Future Site, Crescent Shore's Lake Community Center. They weren't trying to preserve the lake. They were trying to build on it. That's when I stopped reacting and started planning that there's something liberating about clarity, even if it comes wrapped in hostility. When Karen delivered that Final Action notice, she probably thought she was breaking me. In truth, she handed me the last piece I needed to put the puzzle together. That crude little community center sketch, that wasn't just a threat. It was a blueprint, a mistake, one that said more than she ever intended to. I stopped reacting emotionally that day. No more pacing the porch. No more muttering to myself about bureaucratic insanity. Instead, I set up camp on my old oak desk, rolled up my sleeves, and did what Karen never expected. I got methodical. The first step was information, clean, documented, and cross-verified. I began with the deed. Uncle Henry had filed the original property line under the 1974 unincorporated zone, long before Crescent Shores was even a concept. His purchase included the full southern bend of the lake, 12.4 acres of land, dock, and shore. And unlike newer lots, it wasn't parceled or subdivided. No developer had ever touched it. That meant no annexation, no homeowner's agreement, no overlapping boundaries. It was private property, full stop. But I needed more than just an old paper deed. I needed irrefutable, public documentation. So I went back to the county office again. This time, I requested zoning maps, HOA and corporation documents, and subdivision boundaries. The clerk, Sherry, handed me a manila envelope with a tired smile. I was wondering when someone would finally ask for this stuff, she said. You're not the first Karen's tried to muscle out. I raised an eyebrow. Really? Oh yeah, she said, lowering her voice. Last year, she went after the Hendersons for building a gazebo. It was on their own land, but she called it a visual violation. Threatened to have it torn down. They paid the fine just to be left alone. Why didn't anyone challenge it? Sherry sighed. Most folks don't want to fight. She makes it exhausting. I nodded. I don't mind exhausting. At home, I spread everything across my table. Deeds, zoning lines, county plats, HOA articles of formation, all of it color-coded, digitized, backed up twice. It was a war table now, and I wasn't alone anymore. Because that's when Julia called again. She had reviewed the materials I sent her. Legally, you're untouchable, she said. But she's not playing legal. She's playing perception. She's been showing my property on HOA maps, I told her. That's misrepresentation. If she's using that to collect funds or push development, it's fraud. And there it was. That ugly little diagram wasn't just a fantasy. It was a prelude. Karen didn't want me gone because of rules. She wanted the land. And it wasn't just about my cabin. She wanted the lakefront. The cabin's dock sat at a natural curve, a perfect place for kayaking, paddleboarding, or a scenic pier. If she got rid of me, she could expand the HOA's territory, rebrand it as community waterfront, and slap a fee on every use. And if she went a step further, if she leased it out to third parties for events or private gatherings, she'd turn HOA control into personal profit. That's when I remembered something from the packet Sherry gave me. A small item in the HOA board minutes from 2 months earlier. Exploratory review of recreational development opportunities along southern shoreline. They'd voted to begin assessing viable areas for growth. It was vague, easily overlooked, but the date matched the week I got my first violation notice. I pulled up the HOA's most recent newsletters and public-facing communications. Sure enough, nestled in their president's message section, Karen had written a short paragraph about enhancing lake access for Crescent Shores residents. It was a setup, a soft rollout. My removal wasn't just enforcement. It was phase 1. I started documenting everything in a formal report. Every visit, every notice, every photograph. I mapped the exact boundaries, plotted them against county zoning maps, and created an overlay showing that Crescent Shores HOA authority ended 700 feet short of my property. I included screenshots of HOA bylaws, their map disclaimers, even a PDF showing that Crescent Shores was formed in 1999, 25 years after Henry bought the land. Julia helped me draft a letter, this time not to Karen, but to the county zoning board, the state HOA oversight commission, and a local land use attorney named Ron Griggs. Ron was an expert in property disputes and had spent years suing overreaching HOAs on behalf of small landowners. Julia knew him from a prior case. When I called, he didn't waste time. You have 3 things going for you, he said. 1, deeds clean. 2, their documents prove overreach. 3, they've already trespassed, threatened, and attempted to enforce policy on land they don't govern. You could sue them blind. I laughed. Not interested in money. I just want them off my back. Then we'll make that happen. But I want you to do one thing for me. What's that? Make it public. So I did. I wrote an open letter to the residents of Crescent Shores. It wasn't angry. It wasn't accusatory. Just facts. I posted it to the community board, uploaded it to Nextdoor, and sent a copy to the editor of our small-town newspaper. I included excerpts of the deed, the zoning map, and a clear summary of the situation. I wrote, I have lived peacefully in this cabin for over a year. This land has been in my family for decades. It has never been part of the Crescent Shores HOA. The recent threats of eviction, fines, and enforcement are not legal. They are predatory. I will not be intimidated, but I invite anyone with questions to ask them directly. Transparency, after all, is what builds a real community. The next morning, the post had 78 comments. Half of them were cautious but supportive. I always thought that cabin was private. Didn't know they were trying to push him out. Good for you. The HOA's gone way too aggressive lately. A few were skeptical. If he's not part of the HOA, why is he on the lake? But some were furious with Karen. This is exactly what happened to the Coulters last year. They got fined out of their house. So she's been lying about lake access? That's our dues she's spending. By the end of the day, someone leaked an internal HOA memo, one I hadn't seen. It confirmed everything. Karen had instructed the board to approve preliminary budgeting for a South Lakefront Pavilion initiative, citing growing resident demand for water amenities. In bold, it read, once the Mercer parcel is vacated, construction can begin. It was over. The next steps were swift and surgical. Ron Griggs filed a cease and desist on my behalf, citing misrepresentation, property encroachment, and harassment. Julia submitted an ethics complaint to the state oversight body. I submitted a formal complaint to the county land office, requesting Karen's pavilion plans be frozen pending review. Within 72 hours, the zoning board issued a stay on any Crescent Shores development permits. The next HOA meeting was packed. Karen didn't look smug this time. She looked cornered. There's a certain kind of silence that falls before people learn the truth. Not the silence of peace, but the charged, brittle quiet right before something breaks. That was the atmosphere in the Crescent Shores Community Hall the night I walked through the doors with a folder in one hand and a copy of the original deed in the other. The special meeting had been called in response to what the HOA called community misinformation. A letter from the board claimed my public posts had confused residents, misrepresented HOA intentions, and deliberately undermined the board's mission of harmony and progress. They had no idea I was about to detonate the entire illusion. The room was packed. Nearly every homeowner in the subdivision had shown up, some curious, others tense, a few clearly irritated that their Thursday night wine hour had been replaced with HOA drama. Karen sat at the head of the table, spine straight, flanked by 3 board members who stared at me like I was a trespasser rather than the man whose name they'd tried to erase off a map. I didn't speak right away. I waited until the clock struck 7, until every folding chair was filled, until the murmurs died down and Karen tapped the mic with a stiff smile. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, she began, especially given the unfortunate confusion surrounding Mr. Mercer's residence. I stood, calmly, not rushed, just enough to cut her off without saying a word. She paused, annoyed. I brought something tonight, I said, holding up a thick packet. It's a formal response to the HOA's claims regarding my property. I'd like it entered into the meeting record. Karen stiffened. This meeting isn't a legal forum. It's also not a courtroom, I replied, which is why I'm not filing this here. I've already submitted it to the county zoning board, the HOA oversight commission, and the sheriff's office. There was a ripple of conversation. The tone shifted. This wasn't just another violation hearing. I stepped toward the front of the room and placed a folder on the table with deliberate ease. Then I turned to face the crowd. My name is Eli Mercer. I live in the cabin on the south bend of the lake, the one your HOA has tried to find, threaten, and remove for the last 2 months. You've been told that cabin violates community standards, that it was built illegally, that it's an eyesore or a problem. What you weren't told is that my land has never been under HOA jurisdiction. Karen opened her mouth, but I kept going. This, I said, holding up the deed, is a certified property title dated 1974. It shows that I own not just the cabin, but the entire south bend of Lake Kershaw. Over 12 acres of land that predates the formation of crescent shores by more than 2 decades. I paused, letting it sink in. And yet this board has issued me eviction threats. Label my family's home as a non-permitted structure. Shared plans to build a community center on land you don't own, and budgeted HOA funds toward a project that requires removing me to proceed. I turned back to Karen. Do you deny it? Her face was pale. She glanced down at her papers, then back up at the crowd. There may have been a misunderstanding of boundary lines. You believe nothing. I cut in, voice rising just slightly. You posted a development plan that called my home vacant land. You sent security onto private property without consent. You lied to these people, used their dues to fund a campaign based on fraud, and tried to push me out with intimidation. Someone in the back stood up. Is that true? A man asked. You spent HOA money on a park project without telling us. Karen's lips parted. No sound came. Another resident stood. Then another. Karen, you told us that land was public access, that it was under review for safety violations. You said it was abandoned. I watched as the crowd began to shift, not just physically but emotionally. People who had avoided eye contact at the market were now stepping forward, demanding answers. The tide had turned. I walked back to my seat, letting the wave crest without me. Karen scrambled to regain control. Please, everyone, let's remain civil. We were operating under the belief that you were operating under greed, someone else said. We paid dues for this. You've been sitting on a fake plan, hoping no one would check the paperwork. I moved for an audit, another voice called out. Full review of every project and budget item from the last 2 years. Karen's hands trembled. That's not how these meetings work. It is now, a woman near the front said. You're not the HOA. You're a resident, just like the rest of us. The vote didn't take long. By the end of the meeting, the board was forced to agree to a third-party audit. Karen's power was in free fall. And when I handed copies of my deed and zoning maps to the HOA's own legal consultant, who had clearly not seen them before, his face went ghost white. The following week, everything unraveled. The county zoning board issued a statement confirming my ownership and the HOA's lack of jurisdiction. Karen was issued a formal citation for unauthorized enforcement activity. The sheriff's office began a review of trespassing complaints, including mine. And as the community learned the full extent of the deception, how their dues had funded a fantasy pavilion on someone else's land, the backlash exploded. Karen resigned 3 days later. So did 2 of her longest-serving board allies. I got a letter, this time with an actual apology, from a newly appointed interim board president who requested to begin restoring trust between the HOA and all local property owners, including those not under our jurisdiction. He even asked if I'd be willing to attend future meetings as an independent advisor on land matters. I declined politely. The lake was peaceful again, but I'll admit, on the next full moon, I stood out on the dock with a glass of whiskey and looked out at the still, dark water, thinking about how close I'd come to losing everything that had grounded me. They tried to erase my home with paperwork and smug confidence. But all it took was one truth they couldn't dispute. And that truth was written on a piece of land my uncle had walked every morning for 40 years. They say justice is slow, but when it comes, it hits like thunder. In the weeks following that meeting, the air around Crescent Shores felt different, lighter, if not entirely settled. Something had broken that night inside the community hall, and though some residents still clung to the illusion of HOA order, most had seen what lay beneath it, a regime built on assumptions, intimidation, and entitlement. Karen Lowell, once the self-appointed queen of the shoreline, didn't just resign, she vanished. After stepping down, she was hit with a formal complaint from the county for unauthorized enforcement actions, and rumors swirled that her license to operate as a real estate agent was being quietly reviewed. Whether she faced actual charges, I never found out. And truth be told, I didn't care. She was gone. That was enough. The board disintegrated shortly after. 2 of her closest allies followed her out the door, both citing irreconcilable differences with the direction the HOA had taken. The interim board, led by a mild-mannered older man named Craig who'd once served as the community's treasurer, took quick action. A third-party auditing firm was brought in, and the infamous pavilion plan was scrapped in its entirety. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had done the work for me. Instead, I turned my attention back to the land. My land. For the first time in months, I could walk the full trail around the bend without feeling watched. The cabin, once a war zone of letters and threats, returned to its original rhythm. I patched up the siding where the last notice had been nailed, repainted the front steps, and resealed the dock planks. Slowly, I reclaimed my space, not just physically but mentally. One morning, while checking the mailbox, I found a small handwritten envelope tucked inside. No stump, just my name. Inside was a simple note. I'm sorry for not speaking up. I knew something was off, but I didn't know how to help. I'm glad you didn't back down. Laura, Lot 17. It was the first of many. Over the next few weeks, neighbors I barely knew stopped by. Some dropped off small gestures, fresh bread, jars of honey, a six-pack from the local brewery. Others just came to talk. Apologies were never forced, but they were always sincere. I didn't know how deep it ran, one man admitted. I thought she was just strict, said another. Turns out she was building an empire. Each conversation felt like a brick being removed from a wall that had been slowly built between us. Not all neighbors joined in. Some remained distant. But the majority understood something vital now, that silence and convenience had allowed a bully to thrive. And someone standing up hadn't divided them. It had freed them. With the tension gone, I looked at the cabin with new eyes. It had always been a place of solitude. For Uncle Henry, it was a quiet postscript to a life of service and stillness. For me, it had been a refuge from burnout, loss, and noise. But now, maybe it could be something more. I filed paperwork with the county to officially designate the surrounding land as private conservation property. No building, no development, just trails, trees, and protected shoreline. Next, I added a second structure, not a house, but a small detached yurt-style guest retreat. Solar-powered, wood-heated, and nestled between the pines, just far enough from the main cabin to feel like its own world. My idea was simple. Open the cabin once a month to veterans, teachers, or anyone who needed a few days to breathe. No cost, no catch, just a place to recover. I called it the Mercer Retreat. The first guest was a retired firefighter from 2 counties over. He spent 3 nights fishing, drinking coffee on the porch, and reading a stack of forgotten paperbacks. Before he left, he shook my hand and said, "This is the first time in years I didn't wake up with a weight on my chest." I nodded. That's what it's for. The community began to shift, too. Without Karen's shadow hanging over it, Crescent Shores started rediscovering itself. The board opened meetings to the public. Budgets were posted online. Dues were restructured to reflect actual needs: maintenance, trash, and lake preservation. No more fines for garden gnomes or mailbox shades. Craig even reached out to me about forming a lake stewardship committee made up of both HOA members and adjacent landowners like myself. For the first time, the goal wasn't control, it was cooperation. I agreed, with one condition. No maps, I said, smiling, and no pavilions. He laughed. Deal. One crisp fall evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the lake shimmered like a pane of stained glass, I stood on the dock with a thermos of coffee and thought about how close I'd come to leaving it all behind. There had been a moment, right before that first big meeting, when I considered selling. Packing up, walking away, just to avoid the fight. But I didn't, and that made all the difference. Because sometimes, the only thing standing between a bully and your peace is a quiet man with the truth, and a deed that speaks louder than their threats ever could. If you're dealing with an HOA that oversteps its bounds, remember, the law only works if you know how to use it. And sometimes, the deed in your drawer is more powerful than all their threats combined. It's easy to feel small when faceless organizations wield letters, fines, and force. They hope you'll squirm, back down, or simply disappear. But every spine-straightening phone call to the county clerk, every carefully recorded boundary line, and every copy of the original title buried in your filing cabinet chips away at their veneer of authority. Standing up didn't mean I had to yell or pick a fight. It meant gathering facts, speaking clearly, and refusing to be cowed by fake logos and hollow threats. When Crescent Shores tried to erase my home, I didn't just defend a cabin, I defended a legacy. And in doing so, I learned that true power isn't in intimidation. It's in knowing your rights, standing your ground, and inviting your neighbors to see the truth. So if you find a notice stapled to your door or a stranger patrolling your property, don't panic. Reach for the legal documents that back your claim. Call the experts. Talk to your community. Because in the end, the quiet confidence of a lawful deed will always outlast the loudest roar of an overreaching HOA.